So, as Nancy said, I am a shareholder at Lane Powell, which is a law firm in Seattle. And I've actually been practicing law for 45 years, almost 45 years, May 20th. And so I am graduating from the practice of law on May 31st. That's the current plan. So, but all of our practice is involved in the representation of owners and operators of senior housing facilities. And so what I want to do today is just give you a real sort of understanding of the regulatory environment in which they operate, because I understand you've heard from, point-click care and different aspects of the industry, but haven't yet sort of gotten the sense of how regulated this industry is and how those regulations sort of drive how deals get structured. So what we're going to do is we're going to start out, and let's go to the next slide. Okay, so the first thing that you have to understand is, and again, maybe some of this has been covered, but when we talk about senior housing, that's a global term that covers a variety of different facility types. And what you have to understand is what type of facility you're dealing with and then who regulates that type of facility. So the basic types are an independent living facility. And that is really only regulated by sort of local government. And those regulations might be that you need an elevator permit, or you need, if you've got a swimming pool in the facility, you need a pool permit, or if you're serving, drinks at happy hour because everybody wants a happy senior citizen, you need, to have a liquor license. You might need to have a liquor license. So if you're running an independent living facility, it's basically just the local government, that's regulating what's going on there. The next type of senior housing facility is an assisted living facility, and each of these actually is going up by acuity. Right? So independent living is just people who are sort of there because they want the social engagement of being around other people of their own age, but don't really get any services from the facility. Assisted living, next level up, people are getting some services, not as much as skilled nursing, which is the third, and we'll get to that. So assisted living facilities, Nancy actually said something that I'm going to disagree with. There is not a set of federal regulations for assisted living. There's only state regulation for assisted living, and that's why.
I was thinking the Medicaid, Medicare piece.
Right, right. So every state regulates assisted living differently, and they don't all call it, but a lot of states give assisted living facilities different names. Like in California, an assisted living facility is called a residential care facility for the elderly, RCFE. They used to be called boarding homes in Washington. They got away from that. They're called assisted living facilities. In some states, they're called assisted living centers. So you have to look at the state law to see what it's called. But they have a different name in a lot of different states. So you've got states that regulate assisted living facilities. And then again, you've got the same overlay of sort of the local regulation. So an assisted living facility may serve alcohol at a happy hour. They have an elevator. They may have a swimming pool. So they need all of those same local permits that an independent living facility may need. Again, depending on what's in the facility, but there's the added layer that there's state regulation. And we'll talk about, some of what those regulations address as we go on. And then the last kind of senior housing facility is a skilled nursing facility or nursing home. You've probably heard it called that. And again, in that instance, there's state and local governments. Again, there's state licensure laws. There's the same local stuff. But if the facility participates in Medicare and Medicaid, then there's a whole set of federal regulations that go along with that as well. So it's a super regulated industry, which makes it fascinating. And hopefully you're going to end these programs thinking it's super fascinating. So every state agency also has, a different name. So like in Washington, the state agency is called the Department of Social and Health Services, DSHS. In California, it's the Department of Social Services that regulates assisted living facilities, and the California Department of Public Health that regulates nursing homes. So you have to sort of get to know all of these state agencies and what they're called. Now, you want to go to the next slide? So the question is, where do you find these rules that regulate these facilities? So generally what you're going to find is there's going to be a statute, and then there's going to be a regulation, a set of regulations. And so the statute will set out sort of a broad set of rules. And then the regulations drill down and give you more details on them. So in Washington, for example, the statute, where you can find all of the, basic rules governing assisted living facilities, skilled nursing facilities, how they're licensed, how they're built, how they're operated, is in the Revised Code of Washington. And then the regulations are found in the Washington Administrative Code, so the RCW and the WAC. At the federal level, the regulations are found in the United States Code. So like Medicare is in Article 18 of the United States Code, and actually Medicaid is too, just different sections. And then the Code of Federal Regulations, again, is where the regulations are that take these sort of more broader sets of rules and provide greater detail. Okay, what's next? Okay, so the question is, what does it regulate?
Do you want me to interrupt?
Oh, sure, yeah, you can ask questions anytime.
So I just know if that also applies for just like small businesses or other businesses in general, like the statute.
Oh my gosh, yes. I mean, if you just go online and just put in Revised Code of Washington, everything, midwives, and it doesn't have to just be healthcare. Almost every business, there's going to be a set of regulations for different types of businesses. And you can see them in the RCW and in the WACs, absolutely. But what we care about tonight are the ones for senior housing. Okay, so what do they regulate? Like everything. Everything. So the first thing is, like, if you were going to build a senior housing facility, there are regulations that govern that. And the very first thing is what's called a certificate of need. So not every state has a certificate of need program, but what it is just like it sounds. It's somebody making a determination whether this facility is needed. And in some states, there are no certificate of need programs. Washington actually has a certificate of need program. It applies to nursing homes, it applies to hospitals. It doesn't actually apply to assisted living facilities. So you don't need a CON to build an assisted living facility, but if you wanted to build a nursing home, you have to go get a CON, which as far as DSHS is concerned, there are no more nursing homes needed, so you'll never get a CON. There are certain exceptions. There's ways to get CONs, but basically no new nursing homes are being built right now in the state of Washington. You can replace an existing facility. You can take the beds at one facility and move them to another facility, but their theory is there's no need for more nursing homes. But some of the other things that the regulations sort of dictate if you were building a facility might be what the occupancy rating has to be. Like, whether or not it's wood construction or brick construction, whether, the fire rating, can people self-evacuate or not self-evacuate? It might tell you like what kind of common areas you have to have. I was recently looking at something for a client that wanted to know whether or not they could put residents with dementia on the second floor of a building in Washington, and the rule says there has to be a viewing area. So they have to be able to like go out and see the outdoors if you're putting it on a second floor. They mandate that. So there may be rules that talk about the HVAC system. They may tell you like how many bathrooms you have to have, how big the rooms need to be, how wide the corridors need to be. I mean, if you are building a facility, you have to engage an architect who knows these rules and make sure that they design a building that meets the requirements. I had a client one time we were helping them license a facility in Wisconsin. And there's two different licensure types in Wisconsin. And the client thought they were licensing the facility as licensure type A, but I'll get to it in just a second. But the architect had designed type B. And so all of a sudden, they had a facility that they couldn't license because the architect hadn't designed the building that they thought they were building and getting licensed. Go ahead.
I was going to say, so like in certain city plans and stuff like that, so like in the city master plans, like does it change in particular, like with this, like, let's just say like in Washington, so like your time of working, like, has it been in a situation like there's just been like a huge property that's been built, and then like after like 10 years, like the city's like mandating like different things, does that ever happen, like certain structures and stuff like that?
Right. So that's a really good question. So that's almost more of a zoning question. You know, like a particular area is zoned for residential only or for commercial only. And, you know, so you may put your facility in an area that when you built it was zoned for that particular type, and then they may change their zoning code. And what that's called is a legal non-conforming use. So because it conformed at the time it was built, they're not going to go make you tear your building down, but there may be limits on what you can do to the building in the future. So like if it burned to the ground, you wouldn't be able to rebuild it, for example. Or if half of it burned, then you might be able to rebuild it. You have to look to the zoning code to see what it says. And actually, we're going to talk about that in a little bit, because there is, as I mentioned, you know, there are local laws, and the local laws include zoning laws, and the fact that you can't just, unless you're in the city of Houston where there is no zoning code and you can build anything anywhere, literally. But in most places there are zoning codes, and you do need to sort of make sure you're putting your building where it belongs. And I think next week you've got Aegis coming, Adam Clark from Aegis, or 2 weeks. They are like masters of finding a little postage stamp of land and building it. They do. Like all over Seattle, they've got these little postage stamp corners of land where they've built these beautiful buildings, and somehow they, you know, just sort of figure out where they can do it. Yeah?
Is there a reason the state wants to limit the number of nursing homes?
It's a cost issue. They think that nursing home care is more expensive. So nursing homes participate in Medicare and Medicaid. Okay, Medicare is a federal program. The feds pay all the money. There are limits on how much of your care Medicare pays for. Not the intent of this class, but basically like 180 days per spell of illness. Medicaid is a state and federal sharing program. Okay, the feds pay some of the cost, the state pays some of the cost. A lot of assisted living facilities don't participate in Medicaid, so it's cheaper for the state if people are being cared for in an assisted living facility than if they're being cared for in a nursing home. And so what's happened with time, like when I first started doing this, there was no such thing as an assisted living facility. All there were nursing homes. And then people sort of didn't want to be in that institutional of a setting. And so suddenly, you know, somebody came up with this creation of an assisted living facility. And what's happened is people who used to just be in a nursing home now can be cared for in an assisted living facility. And whereas assisted living facilities originally provided hardly any care, they provide more and more and more, but a lot of them, again, don't participate in Medicaid, so it doesn't cost the state money to have residents there. So it's just, it's all bucks. Yeah.
Do you know what the most commonly broken regulation would be?
Oh, no.
Is there any that reoccur often?
You know, I'll tell you one of the really big things that happened. So again, you know, this is just for construction. There's going to be, we're going to talk about it, there's rules for how you run your building too. And caregivers have to write down everything. And there's this sort of mantra in the industry that if it's not written in the record, it wasn't done, even if it was done. That's probably the most common, is caregivers not writing down that some meds were administered or some care was provided. And so a surveyor comes in, we're going to talk about that. That's how you figure out if these facilities are complying with law. There are these people who come in called surveyors, and they come in, they look at a record, they say, oh, I don't see that Nolan got his, you know, ibuprofen at 2 o'clock when he was supposed to get it. He didn't get it. Even if you actually did get it, they have to assume, or they will assume, that you didn't get it. So probably not recording care that was provided or meds, I would say, is probably a very common deficiency. They're called deficiencies. Yeah.
So like when looking, in your opinion, like when looking at like assisted living homes, like if you were to select one, like you know how like restaurants have like Michelin stars for ratings?
Mm-hmm.
In the sense of like, is there like a certain set like group or organization that like rates certain living with facilities, and like, okay, if you like this person says like, or this organization says like a 4-star, it's like a, you know, it's
Right.
more prominent than other ones?
There's not for assisted living. For nursing homes, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, which is the organization that certifies them to participate in Medicare and Medicaid and pays them, has what's called a 5-star rating. And if you go onto medicare.gov, you can look up any nursing home and you can see its 5-star rating. But they've not developed a system like that for assisted living. So really, you're probably relying on like people's Yelp's reviews and things like that. Yeah. Okay, so what happens if you build your building and you ignore these rules? Well, one thing is you could have a building that never can get licensed, right? Because when you build this facility, the state's going to come in, they're going to inspect it. Before they give you a license, they're going to go through and they're going to see if you have complied with the regulations, with the statute in building the building. And if you said, who cares? You're going to have a building that you can't get a license to operate. And so it's really important that you comply with these rules. The class is called risk and regulation, right? So the risk of not complying with these regulations is you got a beautiful building that you can't get a license for. Or I worked on a deal years and years ago where, this was Louisiana, where you can do almost anything if you just pay somebody enough. And this beautiful nursing home, built, licensed, but in fact they cut all sorts of corners and the sewer system started to separate from the foundation of the facility, and there was literally raw sewage running under the building, and they had to close the building and completely rebuild it. So it's very risky not to comply. Okay, so but that is construction. I was going to also mention in this same area, so I've got a deal I'm working on right now, and this kind of goes to your question. My client is buying a facility. If I could see your name, I'd call you by name instead of just pointing at you, but no, it's okay. It's okay. I just didn't want you to think I was rude. But my client's trying to buy a facility in California, and the facility has a use permit, and it says they can only have, how many beds this facility is questionable, but the use permit says they can only have 44 dementia residents in the facility. And it's actually being run as a full memory care facility. Yeah, sellers kind of ignored what their use permit says. But my client, in doing our diligence, we see that this use permit says you can only have 44 residents, and we are dealing with the city right now to try to get that changed. And my client won't close on the deal without knowing that they can run it as a full dementia facility. So that kind of goes to your question. Somebody made a determination in 2000, we've read the minutes from the Planning Commission meetings, that there wasn't enough parking. And they also somehow decided that dementia residents need more caregivers, and so they need more parking. They sort of ignored the fact that dementia residents can't drive because it's not safe. And so there's this limit on how many there can be, and it's like a 64-bed facility. My client wants to be able to have all dementia residents in this facility, and so we have to go work with the city to get this amended. So that's a good example of what you were asking about. It's really interesting, and it's literally put the deal on hold. Yeah. So what do we got next? Okay, so how do you license a facility? Go to the next one. Okay, so when you're licensing an assisted living facility or a nursing home, just a senior housing facility, there's a lot of there's 3 different players in the mix. So there's an entity that owns the real estate. They own the brick and mortar, right? The building that you're sitting in here. Somebody owns the brick and mortar. And then there's the licensed operator. So we call the brick and mortar people the PropCo. And then the licensed operator is the OpCo. And then you may have a management company on top of that. And how you sort of mix and match these people to decide who you're going to get licensed is one of the more interesting aspects, I think, of what we do. So what you, that was perfect. Okay. Yep. So what you can do is you can have a situation where you've got a property owner, that's your PropCo, and they lease the facility to another company, to the OpCo, and that OPCO gets a license. And then the OPCO could engage a third party to manage the facility. Now, all of these could be related entities, or they can all be unrelated entities. But this is one of the most common structures, and this is used a lot because all of the sort of liability risk sits with the OPCO. You know, patients get hurt, patients die. I was just in a meeting today for the firm, and you know, someone was telling a story about a resident who wandered out of the facility and died. When I first started doing this, there's this term used for that. It's called elopement, which sounds really charming, but it's not so charming. It's like somebody getting out of the facility. But they had a resident who left the facility who was found dead. Well, that's where you get sued, right? You get sued for providing bad care, for not keeping your eyes on the people. And so what people do is they separate the ownership of the real estate from the operations because they want to try to insulate the ownership of the real estate from those lawsuits over care, right? Because the real estate, a facility, you've visited facilities? They're big, right? And they cost millions of dollars to build. They're worth a lot. And so what people want to do is they don't want somebody who's suing over bad care having been provided, trying to grab or go against the value of the real estate to satisfy their claims. And so this is a very common structure to have a PropCo, an OPCO, and a manager. But there are some of our clients who don't like the PropCo, OPCO manager structure, and they just do PropCo manager, and the PropCo gets the license. Even though, as I just said, you like to separate the PropCo and the OPCO, some people don't. So another option is just a PropCo and a manager, and there's a management agreement between the property owner and the manager. Another structure is where the property is, again, a property owner and a manager, but the license sits with the manager. And then the last structure is a property owner and a lease, and you just don't have that management agreement at the end. Now, why do you pick which one of these you're going to pick? It's driven by so many different things. Like, for example, this PropCo manager where the manager is the licensee. Years ago, Emeritus, after whom this program is named, Granger Cobb, was acquiring like 140 facilities. And the ownership of the property owner kept moving around. They couldn't just, decide how many investors were coming in, who was going to own what. Well, when a state's licensing a facility, one of the things they're super interested in is who actually owns the licensed operator. Well, when that keeps changing, you can't get through the licensure process because you can't give the state the information that they need to issue a license. So what we ended up doing in that situation was we licensed the manager. We licensed Emeritus, which was going to be managing the facilities because Emeritus's ownership wasn't going to change. That was the first time that we had done that, but we've been able to do it since then. And again, what the state wants to know is if something bad happens at this facility, who can I look to? Whose door can I go knocking on and hold them responsible? And as long as the manager is willing to take that role on, the state is willing to license a manager. So again, one of the reasons why you might pick a structure is because you have to look at where is the ownership sufficiently settled that you can submit your application, show the state who your owners are going to be, and let them license you. Another one might be a lender says, I don't really like that PropCo-OPCO thing because I'm worried that I might not get all of the collateral that I need to get for my loan, all the security for my loan. So I want everything to sit in one entity. And so the lender might dictate that it has to sit with the PropCo. Or there might be tax considerations while you're doing it. Like I said, there's a big emphasis on who owns the licensed operator. And sometimes there are people who don't actually want to be disclosed as part of the application process. I had a client who wouldn't be fingerprinted. And some states require background checks and fingerprints on principals. And this guy was like a Russian oligarch. And he wouldn't be fingerprinted. And so we had to come up with a structure and figure out who we were going to license that took into account that the guy with all the money behind the deal refused to be fingerprinted. And so that may drive your structure as well.
Can I just clarify? I mean, I know the answer to this, but just for the student.
Sure.
When we say manager, we're not talking about, the manager.
Oh,
of
like the
community.
administrator, right.
We are talking
Management company. That's right. We're talking a management company that gets paid a fee
Yes.
for managing the facility.
Yeah.
That's right. And like I say, like this PropCo, again, I don't want to sort of tell you things that are going to make your eyes glaze over because you don't know what I'm talking about. But there are these things called real estate investment trusts, REITs, and there are a lot of REITs in the healthcare industry, and they own senior housing facilities. And they're like banks, basically. And so they will buy a facility, they will own it, and then they'll lease it to an operator. I'll get you in just a second. And the operator is unrelated to them, like Brookdale is an operator. So a REIT, Ventas, may buy a facility and lease it to Brookdale. And then Brookdale may say they want to hire Nancy and her management company to manage the facility for them. So you're right, Nancy. It's not the administrator or the executive director. It's a management company. Yes?
So like you mentioned the Russian guy, he's a special case in that sense, but like, in your opinion, do you think it's more common with like the development of like going towards like Brookdale and more management companies like that, or have you seen like, is it common with like solo operators, like if they want to do private, like, private ownership lease, and then like they're, separate from, they're just the property management, like of their itself, they just own the land, they don't, want to be tied with everything. Is that common with like development?
Most of the senior housing facilities in the country are in the hands of sort of smaller operators. Even though you might read, there's Brookdale with however many hundreds of facilities they have now, or Aegis, which I don't even know how many Aegis has now. The majority of senior housing facilities still sit with smaller operators, which is good for lawyers like me who do transactional work because it keeps us busy because they're constantly being bought and sold. I have a client who once said we did, $1 billion worth of deals involving the same 6 facilities, because they're just bought and sold and financed and refinanced, and, it keeps us transactional lawyers busy. Okay, so what's the next slide? Okay, so we already talked about this, some of the things that can drive it. The other thing that might drive it is just the time of getting a deal done. It's shocking, I know, that clients are impatient, like they want to close their deal. I've got one going on right now, and they're like, okay, we have 55 days until we're closing, so you need to figure out a structure that we can make this work because we're closing in 55 days. It's like, okay. Okay, we'll figure that out. So the timing may also be something that affects how you decide to structure a transaction. But I would say probably the biggest is the ownership disclosure and who's willing to be disclosed and who's not. Again, I don't know how much, you probably haven't paid a lot of attention, but there is a lot of attention being paid right now to the presence of private equity in the senior housing industry, like the KKRs of the world. And a lot of times these private equity companies, they have pension funds, they have investors who don't want to be disclosed publicly. And so that may drive these decisions, which is probably why they're skeptical about private equity being in the industry. But that's another story. Okay, what's next? Okay, so I hit on this a little bit, but again, once you decide among those various entities who's going to get licensed, you then have to submit an actual license application. And the application can be the application process can be very detailed, or it can not be. Like some states, Oregon is a good example. When you're applying for a license, they look at the facility's policies and procedures, or the proposed licensee's policies and procedures for the facility. They look at their resident agreement. They do background checks on the principals. They might make them get, fingerprinted. Other states literally you don't even apply for your license until after you've closed your deal, which is kind of ironic because they should know who's going to be running the facility. But I think those states are states that have sort of said, we don't want to waste our time doing this until we know you've actually closed your deal. But the licensure process can be very involved. It used to be that the process also involved an inspection of the facility. That happens less and less than it used to, and I think that's really just a function of not having enough people to go out and do inspections. But like Idaho is a state that actually still does an inspection of the facility as part of the licensure process, and they may come back and say you've got to do, you know, thousands of dollars worth of work before you can get a license, or the seller does. And then you get into a negotiation. Who is doing it? You know, the seller or the buyer. The other thing that Idaho does that not a lot of other states do is they do what we call a track record review. So if you're applying for a license, they'll go check how you've done, if you have facilities in other states, how you've done as an operator of those other facilities. So I had a deal, you know, last year that went sideways because the buyer had a facility in Tennessee that was like operating under a conditional license, and Idaho said, sorry, we're not giving you a license. And so, yeah, he had to sub in his sister as the owner of the licensed operator. And they let him do that. I know, it's a little surprising. But you have to go through this process. I have a whole team of people. I mean, Nancy was saying when I had my own firm and now at Lane Powell, we have a team of people that this is what they do. They prepare license applications, they submit license applications, they work with the regulators to get them things that are missing when they review the license applications, and that's a big part of what we do. So you have to go through this process in order to get your license. Okay, we're talking about risk and regulation. So what's the risk if you take over a facility without being licensed? Well, the reality is nobody's going to do it because everybody knows you need to get a license. But I have done, I have done deals where some minor step was missed. Like North Carolina has this bizarre process where you have to get a determination that you don't need a certificate of need. And we did a deal once where not our firm, but a prior firm had skipped that step. And when we came along and did our part of it, the state said, oh, there was this prior deal and they didn't comply with that, so they made us go back and do it. They didn't deny us our license application or approval of our license application, but they made us go back and fix the prior mistake. So the risk is really kind of this balancing act between, is there a threat to resident health and welfare, or is it something that can be fixed? And the other thing is, if you take over a facility without being properly licensed, the state could make you close the facility. But there's risk of closing a facility. I mean, people die. It's called transfer trauma. It's really hard on residents to be moved out of a facility. And so the state doesn't want to go there. But if you are so reckless as to take over a facility without getting a license, then in fact you might find your facility closed. The other thing I should mention is, and that's fine, you can leave it there, but in some states, so going back to the question about the management company, so in some states, if you're bringing in a new manager for your facility, okay, I own the facility, I'm the licensed operator, I hold the license, but I want to bring in Richard to manage my facility. And previously, Wyatt was my manager. So I'm changing my manager. In some states, that decision to change the manager of the facility, and again, we're talking management company, not the administrator, not the executive director, is a regulated transaction. And so in some states, you have to submit an application in order to just bring in a new manager. Washington is one of those states, Oregon is one of those states, California is one of those states. And so if you change your manager without going through the right hoops, one of the risks on the prior screen is that that manager may not be allowed to stay running the facility. So again, to Nancy's point, you really need to know the intricacies of what each state requires. And for example, on the change of manager, which we call a CHOM, In Washington, it's like a notice-only transaction, but in Oregon, it's a very fully reviewable transaction. So again, what you have to do can vary from state to state. And in some states, you could change your manager and you don't even have to tell the state. Or you tell the state and they say, thank you very much, and stick it in your licensure file. So it's, again, just a super regulated environment. Okay, so, bless you. So speaking of being super regulated, so you got your license, right? But there's still literally day in and day out, everything you do is regulated. There may be regulations on how much staff you have to have in the facility. There may be regulations, bless you again, on what services you can provide or not provide. And that's a really important point. If you're running a licensed assisted living facility, you need to not be providing the types of services that would require you to be licensed as a nursing home, for example. Or if you're running an independent living facility that's not licensed, you better not be providing the type of services that would require you to be licensed as an assisted living facility. So you really have to look at what services can you provide. And again, those are going to be in the RCWs and the WACs.
Yeah, if a building has independent and assisted and memory care, is that licensing process different at all, or is it just?
No, you're just licensing the assisted living piece of the facility. But that's a really interesting question, because in some states, you can't intermingle those residents. So Arizona is an example. If you have a facility that has independent living and assisted living, the independent living residents have to have their own entrance. They have to be segregated from the assisted living residents. In some states, you can just intermingle people. You might be in one room and your next door neighbor, is independent living and you're assisted living. So again, the degree to which you can combine independent assisted or independent assisted and memory care is going to vary from state to state. A theme here.
But can I ask Randy
Yeah.
to clarify on that one? But you're saying in the example that Richard provided, memory care and assisted living are kind of lumped together for the licensing piece of it?
That's a good question, Nancy. In Washington, memory care can be provided under an assisted living license. In some states, you need a memory care endorsement to your license to provide memory care. And in Texas, you need an Alzheimer's certification if you want to advertise as an Alzheimer's facility. You don't need it to operate, but you need it from a marketing perspective. So everybody gets it because they want to be out there telling the world that they're an Alzheimer's facility. Yep.
What state do you think is the most regulated in Alzheimer's care or dementia care? You mentioned Texas, but
Well, Texas, it's just they regulate, the marketing side of it. I don't know that I have a good answer off the top of my head to that. I could tell you what states I think are the craziest in terms of just licensure in general. There are states we won't do licensure work in, so I'll digress for a minute. California, totally crazy state. We were trying to get a client licensed one time, and we needed a fire marshal inspection to get the final step of the licensure. Couldn't get them in there. I finally called a California attorney who's a colleague of mine. I'm like, Joel, what do? I cannot get the fire marshal out. He goes, this would be my advice. Send a woman from the facility to the local fire department, have her bring cookies, warm preferably, and if she's prepared to cry, that would be helpful as well. And after that, I said, I will never do another license application in California. He was totally serious. And I said, fine, Joel, you go do that. You get the fire marshal out. So really, California's a crazy state. New York is a crazy state. And the interesting thing is, a state that can be an easy state can become a crazy state. It's a function of what's the leadership within the Department of Health. So Arizona used to be an easy state. Now it's a crazy state. Now it's you think you're done, and then they go, oh, we just need one more thing. And then you get them then, we just need one more thing. And so different states, it changes with time in terms of how easy or difficult a state is to work in. Yeah.
Do you think those states that are more strict on regulations in general are better or worse for residents?
That's a good question.
It is a good question. They think they are. I don't know that there's demonstrable evidence that they are or they aren't, but I'm sure that they think they're doing a better job of, protecting the residents and providing a higher quality of care. I don't honestly, know if there's evidence, empirical evidence to prove one way or another. But I don't actually begrudge a state for being diligent in licensing somebody. Because they're like letting a bunch of old people or older people, be in their care. And so I don't begrudge them the diligence that they want to conduct in order to decide who they're going to license. It's just sometimes the process just gets a little crazy. Okay, so just going back to while you're operating. So there may be, rules on how many meals you have to serve a day. That doesn't seem outrageous, but what kind of snacks, what their nutritious, value has to be. There are rules on activities that you have to offer to the residents, how much you can charge. So if a facility participates in Medicaid, by participating in Medicaid, you as a facility are agreeing to accept what Medicaid pays as payment in full for the services that are paid for by Medicaid. Now, Medicaid doesn't pay for everything, so you can charge if there are services or goods you're providing that aren't paid for by Medicaid. But to the extent something is paid for by Medicaid, you agree to accept that as payment in full. And so the rules say that. There may be rules on, who the residents can meet with, how they can organize, what are their rights. So going back again, when I said, whether you change your manager or when you change your licensed operator, there's this whole process you have to go through. Well, in Washington, the residents have a right to get notice if there's going to be a new licensed operator or a new manager, and it's built into the resident rights. And the state takes the position that that is a resident right, so they have no authority to waive that requirement. And it's a 60-day notice. So you can't change a licensed operator or change a manager of a facility in Washington in less than 60 days because of that resident right that sets that 60-day time period, and the state won't waive it. There's also reporting requirements. If an incident occurs with a resident, you have an obligation in certain circumstances to tell the state what happened. And there's also rules on when you can discharge residents from the facility. Basically, you can only discharge a resident for their own welfare, for the welfare of others, if they're not paying their bill, or if the facility loses its license. So you may have a resident in your facility whose family is just so obnoxious, and you cannot make that family happy if your life depended on it. That is not a grounds for getting the resident out of the facility. Those are the only ones for involuntary discharge. Residents' health and welfare of other residents, non-payment, or the facility's lost its license. So you should be careful who you accept.
And some of those would be things like, so maybe the resident's needs have outgrown the care you
Right,
provide.
and that's for their health and welfare.
And that would be their
Right.
health and welfare. Another one kind of to them or another, and I know of this story, or of this case, is sometimes in memory care, the person gets very angry and aggressive and abusive, and sometimes they're very, very strong, and may harm others or harm themselves. That's
Right,
another
and that's the
case
health
where-
and welfare of others.
That's right. And
Right.
even though they need to be in a memory care unit, you're not obligated to keep them in your memory care unit
If you
think
can't meet
they
their
are at
needs.
risk, if you can't, right?
Right.
I mean,
Yeah, but it
I mean,
gets
those things
but it gets
happen.
complicated
It
because you have to
does.
find another place for
does.
them, and again, this meeting that I attended today at the firm, they were telling a story about a resident who hasn't paid for her care for 3 years. And just because you can discharge a resident for non-payment doesn't mean you can just put them out on the street. Discharging is not an easy thing to do. But the point is, as a matter of law, there are only 4 reasons why you can involuntarily discharge a resident. And again, these rules talk about that. Okay, so how do you know? You know, like you asked the question, somebody asked the question, like what's the most common, you know, deficiency? How do you know if a facility is not in compliance with all these rules? Well, there are these people that are called surveyors. They work for the state or the feds, and they come into the facility and they inspect the facility. And they inspect the operations, they inspect the physical plant, they may open the freezer in the, you know, kitchen and see if there's like spoiled food in there. They may look in the laundry room and see that you haven't done a good job of separating your clean and soiled areas of your laundry. They'll look at resident records and see if, you know, everybody's getting the care they're supposed to get. Every resident has a care plan, so they'll sort of compare the care plan to what's in the record. And then they write up what's called a statement of deficiencies. So this is kind of a little picture of what a survey form looks like. You can see where it says statement of deficiencies, and then it also says plan of correction. So when a facility gets a statement of deficiencies, the surveyors come in, they find all these problems, they give it to the facility, then the facility has to prepare what's called a plan of correction. And they say, these are the things that we're going to do to address the deficiencies that you identified. And in some instances, what's the next one say? Oh, okay, we'll get to that. It's okay. But in some instances, the deficiencies may be minor enough that the surveyors will just review the plan of correction and say, you're good, you're back in compliance. In some instances, the deficiencies may be serious enough that they come back out and re-inspect the facility to see if the facility actually did what they said they were going to do. Well, if you don't do the things you're supposed to do, or if the things that the surveyors find, if the deficiencies the surveyors find are so egregious that they won't even give you the opportunity to do a plan of correction, that's where we get into the risk of noncompliance. So what can happen? Well, the worst is that you lose your license. And you know, you generally have a right to appeal. You're going to go call a lawyer if you're threatened with losing your license. But if you're running a really bad facility and the surveyors come in and they see all kinds of deficiencies, they can take your license. Or if the facility is certified to participate in Medicare and Medicaid, you can lose your Medicare and Medicaid certification. And I think one thing that's important to understand is you can't operate an assisted living facility or a nursing home without a license. You can operate without Medicare and Medicaid certification. Medicare and Medicaid is money. It's a source of payment for the care that's provided. So you could lose your Medicare and Medicaid and technically still operate. Now, as a practical matter, you can't because you're going to not have enough revenues coming in. But if you don't have a license, you can't even operate the facility. And so that's the distinction between a license and Medicare and Medicaid. Payment source, you know, permission to operate. So if you've got a really badly run facility, if you're full of deficiencies, you may be threatened with loss of your license and or you may be threatened with loss of certification. The other thing that a state can do, there are these sort of intermediate sanctions. So they may say, you know what, we're not going to let you admit any more residents until you get your act together. That's called a ban on admissions. Or we're not going to let you admit any more memory care residents until you get your act together because you've shown us that you can't provide good care to these memory care residents. They may put conditions on your license. Oregon loves to do that, you know, where you have to have X amount of staffing and you have to submit Y reports to the state, you know, once a month, and you have to bring in a consultant, and they have pages and pages of conditions, and the conditions get lifted when the state decides they should be lifted. It's kind of like, you know, a parent forgiving their kid when they feel ready to do it. They may impose civil monetary penalties. They may say you can't get any more licenses. I've had a situation where we had a client that was going to trying to take over a facility in Washington, and the state said, yeah, no, we're not giving them any more licenses. Their operations at their other facilities are not good, and we're not going to give them any more licenses. So that may be something that can happen. And then there can actually be litigation. And one of the things that's been going on in Washington is every state has what's called a Medicaid fraud unit or Medicaid fraud control unit. They call them MFUCUs. And these Medicaid fraud guys have started showing up at facilities and like raiding the facilities based on bad surveys and saying, well, if you had a bad survey, then you weren't providing the care that you were paid for, and so that's Medicaid fraud. And so these Medicaid fraud investigations are starting to sort of grow out of bad care and also just civil litigation. So, you know, you can't take these things lightly. I've got, I had a client last May, almost a year ago. I get this phone call that, you know, this guy's going to take over some facilities for another operator. And I love my client, but the operator that he took over the facilities for literally has had facilities closed by states, their nursing homes. You know, landlords have put receivers in to run the facilities. Medicare, you know, the feds have closed the facilities, have taken away his certification because he just didn't care. He did not care about the quality of his operations, and he got himself in like major trouble. And so you really do, again, it's a highly regulated industry, and the regulators take their job seriously. They are, you know, some of them maybe a little too seriously, but they take their job seriously. Okay, what's next? Because it's 5:30 and I know these
Can I
people
ask a
probably want to go.
question? No, you're good.
Yeah,
You're fine.
Okay.
No rush.
okay, okay.
So let's say in an extreme case, you've got a crummy operator, a bunch of deficiencies, loses their license. And you alluded to it, I think, just a second ago, but you sort of breezed over it. How, so okay, you've lost your license, but I still have, you know, 62 patients.
You have to
62
move them out of the
residents here.
building.
Okay, so who oversees the move? The crummy operator? Who comes in? I mean,
It's a good
really,
question,
you want-
yeah.
I wouldn't
Yeah.
want crummy people taken care of,
Right. Yeah, that's a good question. Well, it usually is the crummy operator who has to find other places for the residents when the state's taken their license. Now, the state may send in the ombudsman. You know, the state probably will send in someone to oversee, you know, or pay attention to what's going on with the closure process. But the operator who lost their license is the one who has to go find other places for the residents.
So if an operator loses their license, is there a chance that within I don't even know, a certain period of days, maybe a new operator could come in? I mean, how does that, I mean, what happens in the meantime? So, you know, you lose your license, you have to close, but maybe within 30 days, somebody else has taken it over, or how does that
Well,
work?
once it's empty, it's hard to reopen a
So
facility.
you're saying, once you've lost your license and you close,
It's hard to
'cause you've
reopen the
moved them all
facility.
out.
Right,
There is
yeah.
there is no sort of, you know.
Like, no, like a limbo period where the
Yeah,
residents
well,
can be the.
Or what do they call that? Where there's an insurance for, you know, like if something happens to the CEO, there's that insurance that somebody comes in and kind of pays and runs your operation till the dust settles or whatever. But I mean, is there something?
There are things. So there are people that are called receivers. And so if you have somebody.
You said that term in that last little bit. And you
Yeah.
glossed over it. And I didn't know for sure what that meant.
Okay, so there are different types of receivers. There can be a receiver that's brought in by the state, right? The state says, Nancy, you're doing a terrible job running this facility. We feel like the resident health and welfare requires us to go apply to get a receiver appointed to run this facility. Washington actually has a very detailed receivership statute. A lot of other states don't. You know, very clear on what are the grounds for getting a receiver, who's qualified to be a receiver, all of that. So in some instances, it may be the state that comes in and says, we need somebody else to take over this facility. You know, maybe it's a rural facility. There's nowhere else to move the people, so they don't want to see it closed. But states are really reticent to do that. I mean, they've got to think that it's being really badly run. The other option is sometimes a landlord or a lender will be the one who does that. You know, the landlord may say, my rent's not being paid, or the lender may say, my debt service isn't being paid, and I want to bring somebody in to take control of the operations. Now, in that instance, there could be two ways they're taking control. One, they could just be the money gatekeeper, right? Making sure that the landlord gets paid or the lender gets paid, or they might actually be put in to run the facility. So this client of mine that I just said took over all these facilities from this other guy who I affectionately call the young pisher because he's 27 years old and arrogant and doesn't care about the residents in his facilities. He decided, my client leases 3 facilities from him in Washington, and he decided he was going to try to get those facilities back by getting a receiver appointed over the 3 facilities. This is the guy who had his own facilities closed, but he thinks he can get a receiver. Well, he didn't get it, but he did apply to the court for a receiver, and it got denied. And his basis was, well, my rent's not being paid. There was like a month and a half of rent that hadn't been paid. So, you know, so you can, there are ways to keep it from being closed. And honestly, the last thing anybody wants is to close a senior housing facility. It's hard on the residents, it's hard on their families, it's hard on the staff. It's the last thing that people want to have happen. And so even though that is a right and a remedy, it's not commonly invoked. If you see a facility that's going to lose its license, something really bad is going on there. So, okay, so, you know, I talked a bit about, or more than a bit, about, you know, how you get a license, right? Well, let's say you got your license, you've been running your facility, you're tired of running your facility. It's exhausting. Look at all these regulations you have to like comply with all the time. So how do you get out of, you know, being in the senior housing business? Well, one option is if you're the PropCo, you can just sell your facility. I mean, I cannot tell you how many deals we do where like the facility's being sold and maybe the manager's changing, maybe the licensee's changing, maybe not, because the real estate, the facility is its own commodity. It's worth millions of dollars and it can be its own commodity. So one option is the PropCo sells the real estate. Another is the operator says, I don't want to run this building anymore. You know, maybe they're a tenant, probably they're a tenant, and they go and find someone else to take over the operations. Or maybe the landlord says, you're doing a really bad job running this building, I need to bring somebody else in. And so you have a new operator comes in, and we call that a change of ownership or a chow. Did you have a question?
Oh, yeah, you can go ahead, though.
Oh, it's okay, go ahead.
Oh, it was just saying, shoot, it was regards to like Brookdale and stuff like that. It was something about how, shoot, I had it, then I slipped.
Well, I'm here. You can think about it.
Okay. Well, yeah, it was something about like Brookdale and like it was something about like if they're like one of the strongest people in the business. I forgot like what I was like what the question was geared towards, but shoot, it's kind of slipped my head. It'll come back to me.
Okay. All right. So, but yeah, so sometimes, you know, somebody may decide like this facility needs a local touch, right? Maybe there's a facility in Pullman, Washington, and it's being run by Brookdale, which is out of Atlanta or wherever they are these days. Nashville, where are they?
Somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, and it needs local ownership. There's just this sense that it needs a local operator. So, you know, somebody may say, we're not doing a good job running this facility, we're going to get a new owner. So again, or a new operator. So we call that a change of ownership or a chow. And it's a little bit of a misnomer because you may not be changing literally the ownership of the facility, but you're changing who's responsible for the operations. So who, in essence, owns the operations, so it's called a chow. Earlier I mentioned to you replacing the manager, a CHOM. We love our abbreviations in this industry, ALF, SNF, CHOW, CHOM, just love our abbreviations. And then the other way that you might get out is you might close the building. I mean, sometimes a building is old, it can't be, you know, renovated, it can't be modernized, somebody can't really make a success of it, and the owner may just make a decision that it's time to close the building. And so it doesn't happen a lot, but it might happen. I've also had quite a few deals over the last few years where people have like closed assisted living facilities to turn them into like multifamily housing, apartment buildings. And some of those succeed and some of those don't succeed. But I had a client that did it in Spokane. They had a facility right by Gonzaga, and they decided to convert it into student housing. And of course, the residents who were in the facility were out in front of the building with picket signs and on the news saying, you know, we're being thrown out of our home, and, you know, so it can be very emotional. But it does happen, yeah.
So what does happen then for the residents if you're living in a senior living community and they decide to close up? Do they like compensate for like finding other places, or they literally like figure it out?
Only if you're the really difficult person who refuses to move and they have to
Right.
finally pay you to leave.
Right.
So lesson learned. They have an obligation. I mean, again, the same rules that talk about how to operate, there are rules that talk about how to close. You know, you have to engage in an orderly closure process. You have to find, you know, another appropriate housing situation for the resident. And honestly, some people are really difficult, and it gets to the point where the operator may have to pay them to leave, you know, help cover their costs of moving or whatever it may be, underwrite a month at another facility. But again, people don't like closing buildings. But this client of mine that did it in Spokane, they had a couple holdouts that, you know, they had to kind of really work with to get them out of the building. Yeah.
Oh, what's the highest like payout you've ever seen from someone?
You know, I haven't seen how much they've paid them. I just hear the legend and lore that sometimes they have to do it.
What's the legend of
You know, it might be like paying their first month's rent at the new place or helping them pay their moving expenses. It's not huge dollars, but, you know, it pays to be difficult sometimes. Yeah.
Okay, so it came back to me, so you mentioned the big players like Brookdale and some of the other ones, so are like, those companies, are they a two-part business or are they just a senior living business? Because like, they have to do like something within the real estate aspect, do they have like the side of the business where it's like geared towards real estate, or how do they, because they obviously have dipped into like the real estate markets and doing all this, so how does that work?
So that's a really interesting question because, you know, there's a lot of sort of debate within the senior housing industry. When you own and operate, are you a real estate company or are you an operating company? They're kind of both, you know, and they may sell their real estate. I mean, so there's a kind of deal that's done that's called a sale leaseback. So sometimes, you know, Brookdale may take a package of facilities and sell them to like one of the REITs I was talking about before and lease them back because they want to get some cash out of them. So what are they in that instance? They're kind of a real estate company. You know, I mean, so it's kind of this ongoing controversy. It's a really good question because there are people who debate, are senior housing operators real estate company, operating company, or both? And it kind of depends on what you're doing in the context of a particular transaction. Now, there are some companies that literally are just fee-for-service management companies. All they want is management fee income. They get 5% of gross revenues. Maybe they get an incentive fee if they do a really good job managing the facility, but they're literally just a fee-for-service manager. And some companies, that's what they want. They don't want the risk of having to underwrite if the facility's losing money. You know, they don't want to own the real estate. They don't want any of that. Yeah.
Where are those people making their business? Are they getting their business from like companies like Brookdale? Because then like you just mentioned, like there's certain individuals that do
Yeah.
their own thing. How do they find their clientele then? And then like,
They might be probably not so much a Brookdale, like more private equity. Like they might be for a KKR, or there's, you know, Prudential. Believe it or not, Prudential Insurance has a real estate sector that is heavily invested in senior housing. And so they own the facilities and they hire management companies to manage them.
What about Leisure Care? Isn't Leisure Care just a management company?
Yeah, they are now. I think
Yeah.
they are now, and
And
the
that's a-
Lytles
that's a
own the real
Seattle
estate.
company.
Yeah. Yeah, but they separated, and you know, sometimes people will do that. Like, you know, years ago there was a company called Sun Healthcare, and Sun separated their real estate from their operations. They put the real estate in a REIT called Sabra Healthcare, and then they kept the operations and they leased the facilities from Sabra because people basically told them that the company was worth more as two companies than as one combined company. So it's it's a fascinating kind of industry, and it's an industry that keeps remaking itself, and new things keep happening. I had lunch with a client the other day that told me that they don't call their activities director an activities director. They call him a director of vitality. Do you know Leon Grenstein at GenCare?
Of course.
Yeah, well,
That's
so.
a new name, I hadn't heard that one.
Yeah, Leon and I decided we're going to try to come up with a new name for seniors.
Oh, please do.
Yep.
You'll
So
be rich.
I know exactly. So it's a very interesting, ever-changing sort of industry. Okay, but again, you don't have to be in it for forever, right? You can sell your real estate, you can bring in a new operator, you can bring in a new manager, and if you're doing it, then some of the common requirements are, as I mentioned, Washington takes the position the resident has a right to know who the new licensed operator will be, who the new manager will be. So there might be a requirement for resident notice. If you're closing your facility and discharging residents, there's a whole process usually for that. If you're paid by Medicare or Medicaid, there's notices that have to be given to them. And actually, if you're changing the licensed operator, then you have to get new Medicare and Medicaid certification at the same time that you're getting a new license, which is a whole other process. And then, of course, you have to submit a change of ownership application, a license application, get licensed. So you can do it, it's just paperwork intensive. Okay. If you don't go through this, and again, I mean, this is called risk and regulation, so we talk about the risks, but honestly, if you live in this world, you know what the requirements are. But I mean, if you were to, just close a facility and not comply with the state's requirements for closing and discharging residents, the residents could sue you if they got hurt in the process. If you don't do it right, I mean, I had a client that closed a facility in Washington, and we gave resident notice, and the state came in and said we didn't give the right resident notice. And they put a halt to the closure process until we showed them they were reading the wrong regulation. And then they backed off on that. But they might try to delay the process until you sort of jump through the right hoops. Or again, if you do something wrong in the change of ownership process or the closure process, it might affect your ability to get licensed in the future. This whole sort of track record concept. Okay, I think that might be it. So there you go. Other questions? Yeah.
So you're talking about the Spokane facility, how it went from one to the other.
Mhm.
What are the chances that it could be switching back again to the same thing? Is there a certain extent where it has to stop switching so many times?
Well, I mean, if somebody wanted to come in and wanted to relicense it as an assisted living, they probably could, but they'd have to, meet physical plant requirements. And my client made a lot of changes to turn it into student housing, so it probably would cost a lot to get it back up to being able to be licensed as an assisted living. But nobody stops it, as long as you sort of had jumped through the right hoops, they're willing to do it. Yeah.
So do you think, you just mentioned something interesting, one of your customers or clients, they turned a development into a student housing, or structure, so how does that kind of work? Are there big players in that industry that find that white space? Or is there a lot of turnover with senior living communities, being bought out or getting turned into different complexes and stuff like that?
So, like I say, in the last year and a half, I've had several deals where people were buying assisted living facilities with the intent of closing them and turning them into student housing or multifamily housing. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Because, again, these buildings are purpose-built, right? They were built to be an assisted living facility. It may not necessarily work as housing, or it may cost so much to convert it that once they get in and do their diligence, they realize it's not practical. The other thing is, if you're going to do that, then you get into the whole conversation of who's closing the building, who's moving the residents out. Is it the seller or is it the buyer? And so we've had a lot of deals where that's been part of it too.
But
Yep.
there hasn't been any certain specific company doing that though, where they're providing we can relocate all these residents and then
That's a good question. No, there's not somebody who's made that their business plan that I've seen. Yeah. Although there is there is a company, Nancy probably knows this, there's actually a couple now that are doing senior housing facilities on or adjacent to college campuses because of the whole intergenerational, letting sort of seniors come back to college. And so one of my clients was going to do a joint venture with somebody and it went sideways. But there are several companies that are exploring that now.
There's a directory, I think it's got about 85 communities across the country that
I think it's a great idea.
we're working on it.
Yeah, I think it's a great
You can hear
idea.
that from me.
Yeah.
Are there operators that choose just not to take Medicaid and Medicare just for the simplicity of not working at the government?
So to be clear, Medicare is only available for skilled nursing facilities. No Medicare for assisted living. Medicaid you can have in a skilled nursing facility or in an assisted living facility. There are a lot of assisted living facilities that do not participate in Medicaid. They're private pay only. I've actually, interestingly, had several clients recently express an interest in looking at getting into or back into Medicaid at some of their facilities. I think just because they see it as a way to, bring in some more residents. I mean, everybody suffered through COVID. Occupancy went down the toilet. And so I think a lot of companies, not a lot, but companies are starting to look at whether that might be a way to help sort of build census back up again, another source of revenues. But in the assisted living world, I would say more don't participate in Medicaid than do. And like in California, Medicaid's not available for assisted living. So if you have a RCFE, you can't even participate in Medicaid. Yeah.
What's the difference between Medicaid and Medicare?
Medicaid is poor people, Medicare is old people, basically. I mean, so Medicare, on April 2nd of this year, I went on Medicare.
Me too, March 6th. I now qualify for Medicare.
Yeah, me too. But Medicare is basically older Americans, so like I'm leaving my law firm, I will lose my, group health insurance. So Medicare will become my form of health insurance. But Medicaid is if you're below a certain income level, that Medicaid helps to pay for your care. So it was a little shorthand, but it really is an easy way to remember it. Yeah.
So on that same kind of branch there, so I'm assuming that means if the community doesn't have occupancy issues, that they can fill their rooms without taking Medicaid, they usually will? Does that mean that the facility or the communities that do take Medicaid, do you think they're like slightly worse quality for residents or?
Can I answer that?
Yeah.
So, only because I have firsthand experience of that. So, for example, Bishop Place here in Pullman, certain state, does Washington require that a certain number of apartments
No,
in a community
have Medicaid? No, New Jersey does. You have to have 10% Medicaid.
Okay, so for example, in Bishop Place's case, there were some residents there that were Medicaid residents, and I don't know what the arrangement was for sure. I always thought
Was that an Enliven facility? Was
no,
that?
it's a Milestone.
Oh, Milestone. Okay.
Bishop Place is Milestone.
Okay.
And, I misinformed. I thought they were required to have a certain number of their apartments be that way. But, so you have this very nice big building, and for example, let's say we're in New Jersey. So maybe 10% of those rooms, they all look the same. The services are the same. The staff is the same. The meals are the same. Everything is exactly the same. You would not know who was a Medicaid patient and who was paying privately for their living. You don't know. So when you say that now, so no, in theory, no, because actually no one would know. The
Caregivers don't even necessarily know.
That. Only the business office people would know that, really. So no, now, are there probably places in low-income areas where there are pretty sparse housing options for people as they age that may have Medicaid buildings that are, I don't know if the care is less. I don't want to say that the care is less. The building might look different. Some of the amenities might look different.
Yeah, and again, remember what I said. there's rules, right? There's
Yeah.
rules on staffing, there's rules on activity, there's rules on meals, there's rules, and they aren't different for private pay or Medicaid. But if you're a Medicaid-only facility, you're getting paid less. You got less revenue coming in than if you're private pay, because Medicaid does pay less than private pay. So you got to figure out how to comply with those rules on less revenues. So probably the quality of care, the building's a little more, stripped down. There's not a happy hour on, Friday nights with, catered food. Yes, you're going to probably see differences in amenities, but this is my opinion. I think people who get into this industry, they care about older people. And they're not going to distinguish in providing care on whether you're Medicaid or private pay. They're in this for a reason. Now, there are some people who are just in it for bucks. That's the young Pisher was in it for bucks, and that's why he ran his facilities into the ground. But most of the people in this industry care about seniors, and so they're going to provide good quality care, within the parameters of how much money's coming into the facility. And again, they're regulated. People are looking at their operations. Those surveyors come in, that's their job, to find problems. Any other questions? You guys were very attentive, thank you, especially for 4:35 at night. I know, thank you.
Anything else?
Go into senior housing.
Randy, thank
It's
you.
really interesting,
You were
yeah.
incredible.
Oh,
Thank you very much.
thanks.